In 1905, a tomb that had been sealed for over 3,500 years was discovered by Egyptologists. Nothing like it had been found before in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb belonged to the great-grandparents of Tutankhamun. Yet who were these non-royal people who owned a tomb in the royal valley? Two high-powered Egyptian nobles that worked for the pharaoh.
Oh my gosh. We see Amenhotep III as a baby here.
Their children were destined for greatness.
This tomb was not made for I.
A modest tomb that was filled with some of the greatest treasures ever found. This couple helped shape the future of ancient Egypt. Though today we know almost nothing about them. Join me, Curtis Ryan Woodside, as we discover Tuya and Yuya. Tuya and Yuya, the great-grandparents of Egypt's most well-known pharaoh, Tutankhamun. They lived at the time when Egypt's religion and daily life was on the brink of changing forever. But who were they really? They may have been instrumental in the restructuring of the Egyptian royalty. For a century now, people have been misled into believing that the only intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings was that of Tutankhamun. But that is false. Before we had King Tut, there was Tuya and Yuya. They were buried in the Valley of the Kings, and their joint tomb contained some of the most beautiful artifacts ever discovered. How come these two individuals were allowed to be buried in one of the most sacred sites in Egypt's New Kingdom around 3,400 years ago? What makes them so special to be buried alongside pharaohs and royals? They have been pulled through many conspiracy theories in the modern age, from being likened to the biblical Joseph and Moses. Yet, these are mostly found to have no bounding in archaeological facts. We want to discover who they really were. The story of Tuya and Yuya begins in around 1397 BC in Luxor. Thutmose IV is pharaoh and ruling over all Egypt. Thutmose IV focused on many military campaigns during his reign, maintaining and expanding Egypt's empire south and northwards. He famously made peace with the people to the north, known as the Mitanni, who lived in northern Syria. Thutmose made several attempts at peace. Finally, the Mitanni king Artatama agreed. Artatama sent his daughter to marry the pharaoh, and thus linking Egypt and Mitanni. The princess from Mitanni that the pharaoh married can be linked as Mutemwiya, since his other two wives have known parentage and did not bear children. Mutemwiya would go on to give birth to the next pharaoh of Egypt. On this scene, we can see Amenhotep III on the lap of Amun. We see Amenhotep III as a baby here. He is on the lap of his spiritual father, Amun. This is shown happening after his mother, Mutemwiya, has conceived the next pharaoh with the god Amun. There is suggested evidence that Yuya was the brother of Mutemuya. The spelling of Yuya's name is believed to be un-Egyptian and rather of Semitic origins, ending with the ya sound, similar to Mutemuya. There are also stone scarabs which suggest that Yuya was brought to Egypt because of his excellent way with training horses. The introduction of horses and chariotry to Egypt originated from their northern neighbors after all. For Yuya to have been sent to Egypt with Mutemuya would not have been a strange thing, as often when foreign princesses were sent to marry the pharaoh, they would arrive with many staff and family members. Yuya started his career in Egypt as the master of horses, as listed on many of his objects found in his tomb. A magnificent chariot was found in Yuya's tomb, made from wood, leather, and gold. His chariot shows signs of being used, however, for more ceremonial parades rather than battles, showing Yuya's status within politics. It would be at the city of Akhmim where Yuya was given a very grand title. He was named as the prophet of the god Min at the temple there. It would be here in Akhmim that Yuya was to meet his wife, Tuya. Tuya was a noble Egyptian woman. She was the sister of the secondary wife of Thutmose IV. Tuya and Yuya both served in the temple of Min at Akhmim. A splendid wooden statue of Tuya was found in Akhmim, which reveals more about her roles. At the Louvre in Paris, amongst their vast Egyptian collection, is a statue of Tuya from Akhmim. A beautiful wooden representation of Tuya, shown wearing a long dress, large wig, and holding the necklace of the goddess Hathor. The statue states that Tuya was a singer of Hathor, as well as the entertainer of the god Min. Yet a title on the statue will give us a clue as to how Tuya and Yuya would manage to secure their place within the royal family. Tuya was the overseer of the pharaoh's harem in Akhmim. This title meant that she could possibly have a significant role in the choosing of the consort for the next pharaoh. Tuya and Yuya's first child was named Tiye. Being the overseer of the harem in Akhmim, it would not be uncommon for Tuya to place her daughter into the service of the pharaoh. In 1401 BC, Mutemuya and Thutmose IV welcomed a son named Amenhotep. Tuya, whose daughter was a few years older than Amenhotep, started to make the moves to introduce Tiye to Amenhotep, who would become the next pharaoh once Thutmose IV dies. In 1388 BC, Amenhotep III became pharaoh. Presumed to have been between the age of 6 and 12, the chief of the pharaoh's harem, Tuya, through clever moves, had then married her daughter, Tiye, to Amenhotep. Thus, Tuya and Yuya were now fully cemented into the royal family, as their daughter was queen. There was much excitement around the new royals. They issued over 200 announcement stone scarabs announcing the marriage of Amenhotep III to Queen Tiye, and they even mentioned Tiye's parents, Tuya and Yuya. Queen Tiye was only a few years older than Amenhotep, and it appears that they may have had some sort of co-regency for Tiye to be able to assist in the rule of the land. Queen Tiye's status can be seen at the tombs at Asasif in Luxor.
Oh my gosh. Look at Queen Tiye over here. Look at the fineness of this detail. Up here, we can tell which pharaoh this is. Neb Ma'et Ra, Amenhotep. This is Amenhotep III, the father of Akhenaten. He is being protected by Hathor. Here she is, and behind is one of my favorite queens. Just look how beautiful and elegant she is, with the double cobra uraeus on her crown. This is Queen Tiye. She is the mother of Akhenaten, one of the strongest women in ancient Egypt. In this Asasif tomb, we can see Amenhotep III wearing a beautiful leopard print shirt. On this side is the beautiful Queen Tiye with her long blue braided wig. Here on the throne is Queen Tiye, represented as a sphinx. That is just such a great little detail. And she is stepping on the head of a Nubian man. She's pulling him up as a sphinx. She's stepping on him. Below, you can see two captives that are tied up underneath the queen. And here, these are the different enemies of Egypt, all tied up. Asiatics, Africans, you can see a Libyan man all tied up, an Assyrian man over here, and here a Nubian man. You can rarely see how the ancient Egyptians showed the differences, just from subtle changes in the face, skin tone. It's really quite amazing the amount of detail the Egyptians showed to show themselves the differences between all the enemies.
Tuya was given a new post in Luxor, still as overseer of the harem and also chantress of the goddess Hathor. Yuya was also given a new promotion. He was named as chief advisor to Amenhotep III. Thus, he would have a big role in forming the pharaoh's reign from a young age. Other scenes from the period would lead us to believe that Yuya would have worked closely with Amenhotep and educated him on several subjects. Much like Merira, who educated Si-Atum, the brother of Amenhotep. Yuya was also given the title now of Father of the God's Body, to refer to his daughter becoming the great royal wife of Pharaoh. And once Pharaoh Amenhotep had grown up a bit, Yuya became the lieutenant of the army. With their daughter now becoming a flourishing young queen of Egypt, and their new positions in the royal court, Tuya, Yuya, and the whole family moved from Akhmim and settled in Luxor, Thebes or Wasit, as it was referred to at the time. Luxor had several places where royals could live. It was a sprawling city filled with the largest temples, vast agricultural land, and expansive villages, each with their residents having their key roles to fulfill. Queen Tiye lived in the palace complex at Melkata on the Theban West Bank. It is possible that Tuya and Yuya would have lived in this palace near their daughter. There certainly was enough room. However, they may have rather been housed at a village just down the road from Melkata named Pen Sheshen Aten, the very same village where many of the treasures from their period were crafted. We know that Tuya and Yuya lived lavishly. even more so now that their daughter was queen. Many pieces of furniture from their tomb revealed just how opulent their living standards were, a real window into the daily lives of noble ancient Egyptians. Like these 12 woven sandals, a blue and gold wooden box which contained a wig for Tuya with the cartouches of Amenhotep III on the lid. An exquisite throne made from wood, gilded in gold leaf. The sides of the throne are adorned with the god Bes and the goddess Tawaret. Framed by Minoan-style waves is a scene on the backrest of Queen Tiye with a pet cat sitting under her throne. The classic ancient Egyptian combination of black and gold on this ebony chair with its seat woven from reeds, adorned with 3 keys of life and a gazelle on the side. Contrary to common belief, the ancient Egyptians did have cushions and pillows, as seen by this marvelous example of a cushion from the tomb of Tuya and Yuya, which would have been placed on one of these chairs. This throne, however, did not belong to Tuya and Yuya. It belonged to their grandchild, Sit Amun, the daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye. The elegant throne contains 2 busts of Sit Amun. It was most likely designated for the tomb by Sit Amun herself as a way to connect with her grandparents in the afterlife. The backrest shows the princess seated while she is being given gifts from various regions of Egypt. The scene continues on the armrests. The outer side shows the god Bes wielding a knife but also playing the drum. The jewelry boxes of Tuya and Yuya rival those of their great-grandson Tutankhamun. With beautifully inlaid panels of lapis and gold, these would have contained jewelry that was used in their everyday life. The lids feature the god of eternity with his arms stretched out holding palm reeds, and the glyphs for life, strength, and prosperity.
Tiye and Yuya were interred with some of the finest beds. In fact, in ancient Egypt, beds were literally apotropaic devices constructed to facilitate a blissful sleep. And if we have a look at Tuya and Yuya's beds, they all have these adorable lion feet. They weren't meant to be adorable. They were meant to actually protect the sleeper. Now, the ancient Egyptians, they understood that sleep was conducive to good health because we see remedies for insomnia, but they also feared sleeping and dreaming because they didn't understand the neurological implications of sleep as we do today. So for the ancient Egyptians, they thought that during sleep they would be visited by unwanted demons and even people that had died. So they did everything to protect themselves. And if we have a look at Tuya and Yuya's beds, they're also adorned by these images of the goddess Tawaret and the god Bes. Now, both of these deities seem to appear together quite a lot because they were household favorites. Bes is particularly interesting because he was the god of everything that was fun, everything to do with dancing and music and drinking and general partying. But he was also a protective deity that would ward off evil spirits and obviously protect the dreamer while they're sleeping. So he was depicted with achondroplasia, which is commonly known as dwarfism. Sometimes he's seen brandishing a knife and a sword, sometimes playing a musical instrument. Tawaret was a very unusual looking deity. She had the head of a hippopotamus, the tail of a crocodile, and the limbs of a lion. She also had pendulous human breasts, so very unusual looking. She was a household favorite. She would also ward off evil demons and spirits. And she's also a deity that women would have to protect them during childbirth. So both had very similar functions. Now, it's understandable why the ancient Egyptians would fear sleeping, because if we think about it, when we're sleeping, the muscles become paralyzed, irregular heartbeat, accompanied with hallucinations. So we're literally seeing things that aren't there. So we understand these now as nightmares or parasomnias or just regular dreaming. Before the ancient Egyptians, they probably were responsible for early myths about life after death and even demons. So it's understandable why they would have wanted to protect themselves. And Tuya and Yuya had the perfect beds to ensure this blissful sleep.
Even the other family members of Tuya and Yuya were climbing the ladder. Their son and Queen Tiye's brother, Anan, was named as the Chancellor of Lower Egypt in Heliopolis, north of now Cairo. Here, Anan served as the prophet of Amun, as well as the chief astronomer of Pharaoh. He is mentioned on the side of Tuya's coffin, and his statue, now in Turin, shows him dressed as a high priest wearing a dress covered in stars. Tuya and Yuya had another son named Ai. Although many Egyptologists are still on the fence about this, there are slight traces of his name on Tuya's coffin. Ai was born in Akhmim and would go on to inherit all of Yuya's roles and titles, as well as extending the temple of the god Min at Akhmim. In the city of Akhetaten, Ai's titles are visible in his tomb, where he is also named as the father of the god's body, which would link him to being the famous Nefertiti's father. Ai's secluded tomb in Luxor, adjacent to the Valley of the Kings, offers almost no clues, as it was so badly damaged.
So if you have a look at these cartouches, you can literally see that they've been chiseled out, and Ai's name has been removed after his death, and it's probably because this tomb was not made for Ai.
It would be Ai that would be the vizier and succeed the great-grandson of Tuya and Yuya, Pharaoh Tutankhamun. In 1375 BC, life was great for the royal family, and most of Egypt, in fact. Amenhotep and Tiye had been running the country with diplomacy rather than war. They had made alliances with much of their neighboring countries, and the tributes to them were overflowing with gold and treasures. Egypt was at peace with the world, and its inhabitants were thriving. Yet it would be this year that Tuya would die. And only 1 year later, in 1374 BC, Yuya also died. We get the idea that the two were very much in love in life, and maybe he could not go on living without his lovely Tuya by his side, a feeling many know too well even today. Amenhotep and Tiye offered them a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a bold move, as prior only pharaohs and certain royals were buried there. Unlike other nobles who had extravagantly decorated tombs, with some of the finest details of Egyptian afterlife on display, these people weren't even related to the royals. Yet, Tuya and Yuya did not have a single decoration in their tomb, even stranger for the Valley of the Kings. The tomb is actually roughly cut inside, and it is probable that the tomb was started shortly after Tuya's death to place her mummy inside before the 70 days ancient custom for mummification had passed. And thus, when Yuya died a year later, there would be almost no time at all to complete their tomb. However, being buried in the valley was already an honor. Their tomb was filled with some of the most beautiful artifacts ever found. But why, unlike other tombs in the valley, was their tomb not robbed and emptied out? You see, contrary to common belief, the tomb of their great-grandson Tutankhamun had actually been broken into in antiquity. Hundreds of years after Tutankhamun was laid to rest, Egypt fell into a decline, and the desperate public began robbing tombs to steal the gold to sell. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings were under guard, and it would appear that the men that broke into Tut's tomb were caught in the act. Though they had enough time to rummage through the first chamber, yet they were caught before they could get away with the pharaoh's treasures. The same thing occurred to Tuya and Yuya's tomb. In 1905, on the 5th of February, their tomb was discovered by James Quibell and Theodore Davis. A steep descending passageway was found. The opening was too steep and narrow for a grown man to enter. They got a young Egyptian boy to jump down. He emerged moments later holding 3 beautiful treasures: a small piece of a chariot, a walking stick, and a stone scarab gilded with gold. This stone was the heart scarab of Yuya that once hung around his mummy's neck. This scarab was covered in prayers intended to help him reach the afterlife, to be used in the weighing of the heart ceremony before the god of the afterlife, Osiris. But why were there such precious objects laying in the descending corridor? Tuya and Yuya's tomb showed evidence that it had been robbed indeed. However, it appears that, like their great-grandson, the intruders in the tomb were caught in the act of robbing. They were interrupted by the guards and obviously dropped some objects on the floor while fleeing away. Thankfully, the robbery was stopped, because today we can marvel at their splendid treasures. A few days later, on the 13th of February, after clearing the doorway, Theodore Davis entered the tomb of Tuya and Yuya. He described this event as such: "The chamber was as dark can be, and extremely hot. We held up our candles, but they gave so little light and so dazzled our eyes that we could see nothing except the glitter of gold." They had just witnessed one of the most spectacular discoveries in archaeological history, many years before Howard Carter saw Tutankhamun. Their fears of a break-in were confirmed inside. The tomb was in array. The coffins had been opened and objects were scattered all around. Even the mummies of Tuya and Yuya had been partially unwrapped Clearly, the ancient robbers had been looking for the amulets and jewels before they were interrupted. And like their famous great-grandson, Tuya and Yuya also had exceptionally beautiful gold death masks. Yuya's mask was of a more simple design, gold with lapis, quartz and obsidian eye inlays. He is depicted wearing a simple headcloth, and his ears are not pierced, much like his mummified body. Not having pierced ears was uncommon for Egyptians, thus giving more evidence that Yuya was foreign. Tuya's mask was gold. She also has inlaid eyes, yet the collar is bejeweled with some of the most colorful and precious stones. She is wearing a large wig with the crown of a lotus flower on her brow. Her linen wrappings were secured with resin, which the residue is still showing through. These beautiful masks were once upon their mummified faces in order for the gods to recognize them on their journey to enter the next life. And to help them into their next life was their Book of the Dead. At 20 meters long, it is one of the longest and best preserved pieces of papyrus that has ever been discovered. The beautifully illustrated papyrus contains many spells and prayers to help Tuya and Yuya to be welcomed by Osiris. Yuya would have been planning his Book of the Dead from the moment he could afford it. Showing his age, he has white hair, however, a black beard. Featured on the papyrus is a scene showing the funeral of Yuya taking place, his sarcophagus on a sledge being pulled by bulls and arriving doing the opening of the mouth in front of his tomb. With white hair, wearing a fine white linen dress, is Yuya receiving offerings from two priests. One gives him linen, while the other cleanses him with water.
In Egyptian iconography, a person's ba or soul was depicted as a human-headed bird. The ba was considered important in the afterlife because it would visit the world of the living during the day and the world of the deceased during the night. Another piece to connect Yuya to this life and the next was his very own ba bird shown on his papyrus, as well as a beautiful statuette with a small beard and black wig. He wears a beige tunic and a heart scarab held by a lapis and gold necklace, the same one that was found in his tomb, meaning we can expect Yuya to have presented himself like this. The ba was the spirit, an extension of the person. There's a ba bird.
Among many of the objects found were many shabtis. Their purpose was to make the life of the deceased easier in the next life. Basically, they were little servants. Each one contained specific texts written on their body that pertained to certain duties, and there was a chief shabti who controlled the other shabtis, as they all had their own little personalities. Intriguingly, many food parcels were found in the tomb containing cuts of beef. Many of these boxes were shaped like the food themselves. They also had several pottery vessels. However, they were painted to look like stone, almost imitating the style, and were decorated beautifully. A wreath of flower petals painted around the lid, or even a molded daisy on the top. These vases look rather out of place compared to what we know about ancient Egyptian pottery. These contained sacred oils, and on the lid they had different animals such as a cow, a goat, and a frog.
The Osiris bed discovered in the tomb of Tuya and Yuya is really interesting. It's made of wood, reeds, clay, cloth, barley, and plants. Clay was placed in the shape of the body of Osiris, and then barley was planted into this. Beds such as this represented the concept of life springing from death, thereby denoting the resurrection of the god Osiris.
And symbolizing Tuya and Yuya's quest for eternity were their golden sarcophagi, like this one of Yuya. And another one painted with black stripes on it for Tuya. Their coffins were also nested, similar to Tut, and contained different levels of mummification processes and different decorations as you went further down towards the mummy.
Amongst the artifacts discovered in the tomb were the canopic boxes of Tuya and Yuya. During the New Kingdom period, canopic boxes were widely used to store the internal organs of the elite during the mummification process. Tuya's magnificent canopic box rests on a sledge. The vases containing the internal organs, when discovered, were tightly packed with cloth and little mummiform packets with gilt heads, and they were fixed in sawdust. Used canopic vases are all human-headed and not quite as exquisite as Tuya's. Each of the vases contain a package wrapped in cloth, nearly filling its cavity, some of which are too large to really allow the lids to settle into place. Tuya and Yuya's tomb is one of the tiniest in the Valley of the Kings. It's undecorated, uninscribed, and unremarkable compared to the lavishly decorated tombs of some of the pharaohs. However, the contents discovered within the tomb are remarkable and quite exquisite. When the tomb itself was discovered, there was a real fear of robbery, and to avoid this, the contents of the tomb were moved to Cairo with great speed. The day that this was decided was a particularly grueling day. The scorching heat was so debilitating that over half of the people that were employed to move the contents had given up by midday, and the rest of them powered on, and thanks to them we get to marvel at these beautiful artifacts in Cairo today.
All of these artifacts may be beautiful, yet the real treasure preserved in the tomb is not made of gold. I'm talking about the actual bodies of Tuya and Yuya. They are the most precious of all that was discovered in their tomb.
When Tiye and Yuya's mummified human remains were discovered, it was quite apparent that their bodies had been disturbed by ancient tomb robbers. Despite this, they were remarkably beautifully preserved, and it would be anatomist Grafton Elias Smith who would be assigned with studying them. I feel he was probably the right person for the job because his position as the first professor of anatomy at the Government Medical School of Cairo allowed him to actually study a lot of human remains that were excavated by archaeologists at the time. But his first real experience with Egyptian mummies would be when he was invited to study a pre-dynastic cemetery at Al-Amra. He actually was looking for naturally, perfectly preserved human brains. He would then go on to study a lot of the royal mummies. He also studied a lot of priests and even commoners. So he had a lot of experience, and this allowed him to really look at the evolution of mummification itself and the different practices during different time periods. When he's looked at the mummy of Yuya, he was taken back by how natural he looked, because a lot of the mummies that he'd studied, they'd sort of blackened because of the resin. With Yuya, he described his expression as very benevolent and very graceful looking man. Yuya had a lot of hair on his head, which would have been white during his lifetime, but the hair had turned this sort of yellowish blonde color, which is probably due to oxidative stress, protein degradation, and the embalming materials that were used. And we do see this in a lot of other mummies as well, where the hair sort of turned this blondish color. But with Yuya, it was very yellowish, more than blonde.
Blonde hair does seem to have become a trend in ancient Egypt. Several blonde human hair wigs have been found. At El Kab, tombs dating to the time around Tuya and Yuya, there are some images of people shown with yellow or blonde hair.
Look at her hair. I'm not quite sure if it has not been painted in with the black or whether she actually had this blonde hair, because we have examples of some Egyptians with blonde hair, and also we have examples of blonde hair being used for wigs. It's very rare, but there's a few. She could have been one of those few with blonde hair. Some tombs we even see the men with short cropped blonde hair, which could have been dyed with henna, but some of them really did have that blonde hair. But just look at her sitting here with her little round earrings, beautiful turquoise necklace. Unfortunately, her husband is gone here, but she is just magnificent.
The mummy of Yuya, his eyelashes were still intact, his eyebrows as well, and he had a bit of a stubble on his face, probably about 3 millimeters thick, which shows that he hadn't shaved before his death for a few days. His eyes had been packed with linen and resin, and once they were inserted, the eyelids were drawn over the linen. He also noticed that he had sort of subcutaneous packing in his face as well, which gave him this wonderful lifelike appearance. And he said that Smith describes his nose as prominent, aquiline, and with quite a high bridge. He was slightly smiling, which was beautiful to see. And he also noticed that his face was quite wrinkled. His hands were sort of resting just underneath his chin, his arms were flexed, and his body had actually been very tightly packed with lots of resin and linen. So the linen would have been soaked with resin, which starts off quite liquid. And trees actually produce resin when they're injured. It has antibacterial, antifungal properties. It also has a very sweet fragrance, so it's understandable why the Egyptians used resin. But once it's inserted in the body, it solidifies and becomes very glue-like. Smith also noticed that Yuya had a gold metal plate placed in the embalming incision. He basically wasn't very tall. He was about 5'5", which actually is not bad for an ancient Egyptian. One of his fingernails had a gold stole attached to it. This would have been to keep the nails in place. Unfortunately, he didn't work out the cause of death. And now when he went on to study Tuya, his wife, again he was taken back by how beautiful she looked. She was so lifelike and very naturally preserved. With Tuya, a lot of her wrapping was damaged, much more so than her husband. He actually got Douglas Derry to assist him with studying Tuya. Now, Douglas Derry is the anatomist that would go on to study their great-grandson Tutankhamun. Now, Derry noticed that in her feet she was wearing gold sandals, and underneath the soles were made of metal plate. There was also a hieroglyph design found within her wrappings in gold foil, which had her titles. She was described as a little old woman by Smith because, like her husband, she had white hair, but she was completely bald from the top, but had sort of wavy-ish hair on the sides and at the back. And she was actually wrinkle-free. So maybe it was a little bit unfair for them to call her a little old woman. But she was very short, under 5 foot tall, probably about 4'11". The latest CT scans of Tuya and Yuya give us a little bit more information. So with Yuya, it was confirmed that he had subcutaneous packing in his face, which gave him some great symmetry and a very natural looking appearance. He also had granular sort of material inside his neck and in his mouth. His brain had been extracted, so he'd gone through excerebration. But there was a little bit of brain residue left in his skull cavity. Now, once the brain was removed, resin had been introduced twice into his skull cavity. This would have probably been to preserve the integrity of the skull. Resin was also used, of course, for his fragrance and probably to trap insects that might have gone inside the skull cavity and really to lock in the brain residue as well. Now, with his nasal cavity, they also found resin in there as well. His teeth were in particularly poor condition. There was not just alveolar resorption, but there was a lot of attrition in his teeth. This is the wearing down of the teeth. The team found that he'd been eviscerated, but his heart was still retained in his body. Interestingly, his left big toe was missing, but this was most likely post-mortem. Unfortunately for the team, they couldn't find a cause of death, so we don't know how he died. Now with Tuya, she was also determined to be around 50 to 60 years of age when she died. She had been completely excerebrated. Her brain had been removed through transnasal craniotomy, which is removal of the brain through the nose. And she did actually have a little bit of remnants of dura, which is the membrane that surrounds the brain. It's quite a tough membrane. And we see this in quite a few ancient Egyptian mummified individuals. She actually had her ears pierced, whereas Yuya didn't. There was no piercing in Yuya's ears. So Tuya, her left ear, actually had 2 piercings, and the right ear had 1. But she also had piercings on the top of her ears, which might have been in vogue at the time. Her mouth and upper throat were filled with linen, and just like Yuya, her teeth were in particularly bad condition. She had attrition and she had multiple missing teeth as well, so not great for her. She had also been eviscerated, but her heart had been retained in her body, and just like Yuya, her body cavity was filled with linen which had been soaked in resin, so this has solidified, but she had also been packed with what looked like sand or mud as well. Unfortunately, just like Yuya, no cause of death could be determined, but what was discovered was a severe case of scoliosis, which would explain why she was so tiny, so she could have actually been a little bit taller in life.
And now, using the information from the CT scans of both Tuya and Yuya, I can do a facial reconstruction to see what they could have actually looked like. Tuya and Yuya would not have known their great-grandson Tutankhamun. They died just on the cusp of Egypt facing its most tumultuous time, a time that would shake the entire history of Egypt to the core. The religious revolution brought around by Akhenaten and their granddaughter Nefertiti, the glorious return of the old ways under their great-grandson Tutankhamun, and the succession by their son Ai. Maybe their deaths before these disturbing events was a blessing, so that they could die remembering the great splendor of the land they experienced. Tuya and Yuya may be almost unknown today. They were one of the most important couples in Egyptian history, and their shining legacy shall live on for eternity.